The sound of tearing fabric ripped through the iron lantern bar like a gunshot. Every conversation died. Every glass stopped midair. Annie stood paralyzed, her black work shirt torn open at the chest, exposing not just skin but raw terror. The tattooed drunk who'd grabbed her laughed a sick, triumphant sound that echoed off the walls. "Who's gonna stop me now?" he roared, his massive arms spread wide like a challenge to God himself. The bar held its breath. Then, from the back corner, a chair scraped against wood, slow, deliberate, like the cocking of a gun. A man in a tailored black suit rose to his full height, his chest tattoos visible beneath the open jacket, his slicked back hair catching the amber light. His face was carved from stone, his eyes colder than December. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You just made the last mistake of your life. If you're hooked in and want to enjoy this story, go ahead and subscribe, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see where everyone's watching. Plus, tomorrow I've got another incredible story lined up, and you definitely don't want to miss it." Alright, back to the story. Annie's shift had started like any other, exhausting, endless, barely profitable. She'd clocked in at 4 p.m., her feet already aching from the morning shift at the diner across town. 2 jobs, 16-hour days, all to keep her mother's medical bills from drowning them both. The Iron Lantern wasn't the worst bar in the city, but it wasn't far from it. Dim lighting hid stains on the walls. The jukebox played the same 12 songs on repeat. The clientele ranged from dock workers blowing their paychecks to low-level criminals conducting business over warm beer. Annie had learned to navigate it all. Keep your head down, smile when necessary, never engage more than required. She'd lasted 2 years by being invisible, just another waitress serving drinks to men who barely saw her as human. But tonight, someone had seen her. The bully had walked in around 11, already drunk from 3 other bars. Tattoos covered both arms, crude, prison-quality ink that told stories of violence. His beard was unkempt, his eyes bloodshot and mean. He demanded whiskey in a voice that made other patrons shift in their seats. Annie had served him carefully, keeping her distance. Her smile professional but cold. She'd dealt with men like this before. Usually, they drank themselves into stupidity and left. Not this one. When she'd brought his 4th glass, he'd grabbed her wrist. His grip was iron, his breath hot and reeking of alcohol. "Stay and talk to me, sweetheart," he'd slurred, pulling her closer. "Sir, I have other customers." That's when he yanked her forward with brutal force and ripped her shirt. The fabric tore with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the suddenly silent bar. Annie gasped, stumbling back, her arms instinctively crossing over her chest. 40 pairs of eyes watched. No one moved. The bully stood, swaying slightly, grinning like he'd won something. "Who's gonna stop me now?" he bellowed. "Anyone?" The silence was deafening. And then Rick Burton stood up. Annie had noticed him before, impossible not to. He'd been coming to the bar 3 nights a week for the past month, always sitting in the same corner booth, always alone, always nursing a single glass of bourbon he never finished. He was tall, powerfully built, with a presence that made people nervous without him saying a word. His black suit was tailored perfectly, his chest tattoos visible beneath the open jacket. His hair was slicked back, his jaw sharp, his eyes dark and unreadable. Annie had assumed he was dangerous, everyone did. But he'd never caused trouble, never raised his voice. He watched, observed, and left generous tips in silence. She didn't know his name. She didn't know he'd been watching her specifically, not with lust, but with something else. Protection, recognition, the way someone watches over something fragile in a world full of predators. Tonight, that watching ended. Rick moved forward with terrifying calm. Each step deliberate, each movement controlled. His associate, a heavily tattooed man named Vic, rose from a nearby table. Another man, lean and silent, blocked the door. The bully's grin faltered as Rick approached. Recognition flickered in his drunken eyes, not of the man, but of danger itself. "Hey man, I didn't mean—" "You didn't need to mean it," Rick said quietly, his voice like gravel underfoot. "You just needed to keep your hands to yourself." Rick's fist moved faster than thought, a single, devastating punch that sent the bully crashing into the bar. Bottles shattered, glasses exploded. Before the man could recover, Rick grabbed him by the throat and slammed him against the wall, lifting him off the ground with one arm. The bully's feet kicked uselessly in the air. "Touch her again," Rick whispered, his face inches from the bully's, "and I'll make sure no one ever finds you." He dropped the man, who crumpled to the floor like a broken doll, gasping for air. Rick's men materialized from the shadows, dragging the bully out the back door. His protests died as the door slammed shut. The bar remained frozen. Rick turned to Annie, who stood trembling, arms still wrapped around herself. Without a word, he shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The fabric was warm, expensive, and smelled faintly of cologne. Their eyes met for a single moment, his cold and unreadable, hers wide with shock and something else. Gratitude, confusion, fear of a different kind. Then Rick walked toward the door, his men following like shadows. Annie stood alone in the wreckage, her heart pounding, her world forever changed. She didn't know it yet, but that moment, the moment Rick Burton decided she was worth protecting, would reshape both of their lives in ways neither could predict. Because something had shifted in the darkness of the Iron Lantern bar. Annie had been seen, and Rick Burton never looked away from the things he decided to protect. Rick Burton didn't go home that night. He stood in the alley behind the Iron Lantern, watching his men shove the bully into the back of a black sedan. The man was still conscious barely, his face already swelling from where Rick's fist had connected with bone. "Boss," Vic said, wiping blood from his knuckles. "What do you want us to do with him?" Rick lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his face in the darkness. His expression was unreadable, not angry, not satisfied, just cold, like he'd done nothing more significant than swat a mosquito. "Break his hands," Rick said quietly. "Both of them. Make sure he remembers what happens when you touch things that don't belong to you." Vic nodded and climbed into the car. The engine roared to life, and the sedan disappeared into the night, carrying the bully toward a lesson he'd never forget. Rick remained in the alley, smoke curling from his lips, his mind somewhere else entirely, somewhere 14 years in the past. Her name had been Kara, Rick's younger sister. 15 years old, bright-eyed, still innocent despite growing up in their father's world of violence and debt. Rick had been 17, angry at everything, convinced he was invincible. He'd been out that night, some stupid party, some girl whose name he couldn't remember. Kara had called him 3 times. He'd ignored every one, too drunk and too arrogant to care. The men who'd come for their father's debts found Kara instead. By the time Rick got home the next morning, still reeking of cheap beer and cheaper perfume, police cars surrounded their building. His mother was screaming. His father was being dragged away in handcuffs, not for what he'd done, but for what he'd failed to prevent. Kara was gone. They found her body 2 days later in an abandoned warehouse on the docks. The autopsy said she'd died within hours of being taken. Hours Rick had spent laughing at a party while his sister screamed for help that never came. He'd failed her. That failure had carved something out of Rick's chest, something that never grew back. In its place grew something else, something harder, darker, more dangerous. Rick had spent the next 14 years building an empire on the foundation of that guilt. He'd learned to fight, to kill, to control. He'd climbed from street-level enforcer to Mafia boss, leaving bodies and broken men in his wake. People feared him. Governments couldn't touch him. His word was law in half the city. But none of it brought Kara back, and none of it filled the hole where his heart used to be, until he saw Annie. Not because she looked like Kara, she didn't, but because of how she moved through the world. Exhausted but kind, struggling but never complaining, apologizing for existing, even when she had every right to take up space. Rick had noticed her 6 weeks ago, the first time he'd walked into the Iron Lantern for a meeting. He'd been there to discuss territory with a lieutenant, but his attention kept drifting to the waitress with the tired smile and gentle hands. She'd served them drinks without flinching, even though Rick's reputation preceded him like a storm. Most people couldn't look him in the eye. Annie had looked directly at him, polite but unafraid, and asked if he needed anything else. Something about that moment had cracked the ice. He'd started coming back, not for business, just to watch, to make sure she was safe in a place where women like her rarely were. He told himself it wasn't obsession. It was vigilance, responsibility, the second chance he'd never gotten with Kara. Tonight, that vigilance had become action, and Rick didn't regret a single broken bone. Inside the bar, sirens wailed in the distance. 2 patrol cars pulled up, their lights painting the walls red and blue. Officers entered with hands on their holsters, expecting trouble. They found Rick standing at the bar, finishing his bourbon. "Mr. Burton," the lead officer said carefully. Everyone in the department knew Rick Burton. Some feared him, some were on his payroll. Most just wanted to avoid him entirely. "Officer Mitchell," Rick replied, setting down his glass. "Problem? We got a call about an assault." "There was an assault," Rick said calmly. "The man who committed it left in an ambulance about 20 minutes ago. Ask anyone here, he attacked my waitress." I intervened. Self-defense on her behalf. Mitchell looked around the bar. 40 witnesses stared back, their expressions uniform. The boss is telling the truth. Don't ask us to say otherwise. Your waitress? Mitchell asked carefully. Rick's eyes narrowed. A woman under my protection. Is that a problem? Mitchell glanced at his partner, who shook his head slightly. They both knew how this worked. Rick Burton didn't lie, he didn't need to. And if 40 witnesses said the bully started it, then the bully started it. We'll need statements, Mitchell said. You'll get them. The officers took statements from staff and patrons, all of whom confirmed the same story. Drunk stranger attacks waitress, gets what he deserves. Annie, wrapped in Rick's jacket and still trembling, gave her statement in a voice barely above a whisper. Rick watched from across the room, his expression unreadable. When the police finally left, the bar slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Conversations resumed, glasses refilled. But something fundamental had changed. Everyone knew now. The waitress was under Rick Burton's protection, and in this city, that meant she was untouchable. Rick caught Annie's eye one last time before leaving. She stood by the bar, his jacket still draped over her shoulders, her eyes full of questions she didn't know how to ask. He gave her the smallest nod, barely perceptible, then walked out into the night. Annie watched him go, her heart still racing, wondering who exactly had just saved her life, and why a man like Rick Burton cared whether she lived or died. Annie didn't sleep that night. She sat on her threadbare couch in her studio apartment, still wearing Rick Burton's jacket. She'd tried to take it off 3 times, but each time her hands shook so badly she gave up. The fabric felt like armor, expensive, warm, smelling faintly of cologne and smoke. It was 4 a.m. when she finally looked down at her torn shirt beneath the jacket. The fabric hung open, exposing the cheap sports bra underneath. She'd walked home like this, too numb to care, too exhausted to change. Now, alone in the darkness, the reality crashed over her like a wave. She'd been attacked, humiliated, exposed in front of 40 strangers, and saved by the most dangerous man in the city. Annie pulled the jacket tighter around herself and finally let the tears come silent, hot, streaming down her face until she had nothing left. By morning, she'd convinced herself to quit. The Iron Lantern wasn't worth this. No job was. She'd find something else, another diner, maybe a retail store, somewhere without drunks and violence and men who thought they could take whatever they wanted. But when she checked her bank account, reality stared back at her in cold numbers. $247.63. Rent was due in 5 days. Her mother's medication cost $180. The electric bill was overdue. She couldn't afford to quit. She couldn't afford to have principles. So at 3:45 p.m., Annie put on a high-necked black shirt that covered everything, tied her hair back, and walked to work with her head down and her heart pounding. The moment she stepped through the Iron Lantern's doors, every conversation stopped. 40 pairs of eyes turned toward her, the same eyes that had watched her humiliation, the same faces that had sat frozen while she was attacked. Annie's breath caught. She almost turned around and ran. Then Tommy, the old dock worker who sat at the end of the bar every night, stood up. He nodded once, respectfully, and turned back to his beer. One by one, others did the same. A nod, a respectful glance, then back to their drinks. It wasn't an apology, men like these didn't apologize, but it was acknowledgement, respect, in the only language they knew. Annie released a breath she didn't know she'd been holding and walked to the back to clock in. Her manager, Dale, was waiting by the time clock. He was a wiry man in his 50s who'd worked at the Iron Lantern for 20 years and had seen everything twice. "Annie," he said carefully, "you okay?" "I'm fine. You don't have to work tonight. I can call someone." "I'm fine," she repeated, more firmly. She couldn't afford to miss a shift, couldn't afford the kindness. Dale studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "The guy from last night, he's banned. Permanently. Already told the door staff. If he even looks at this building, they'll handle it." Annie nodded, her throat tight. "And, Dale scratched the back of his neck awkwardly. "Mr. Burton's jacket. He called this morning. Said you can keep it or drop it off whenever. No rush." Her heart skipped. "He called?" "He called. Yeah, he also said if anyone gives you trouble, any trouble, we're supposed to call him immediately." Dale's expression was unreadable. "Annie, I don't know what happened between you two, but Rick Burton doesn't protect people. He uses them or destroys them. Be careful." Annie didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded and headed to the floor. The shift was surreal. Customers who'd normally bark orders or snap their fingers spoke to her politely. Men who usually let their eyes linger too long now looked away. Even the regulars who'd always been respectful seemed extra careful, like she was made of glass. It took Annie 2 hours to realize what had changed. They were afraid. Not of her, of him. Of Rick Burton and what he'd do if anyone stepped out of line. She was no longer just Annie, the exhausted waitress nobody noticed. She was Rick Burton's waitress, the woman under the Mafia boss's protection. The realization made her stomach turn. She didn't want to be defined by someone else's violence. Didn't want to be safe only because men feared retribution. But she couldn't deny the relief, either. For the first time in 2 years, she worked a shift without being grabbed, propositioned, or degraded. For the first time in her life, she felt untouchable, and she hated that it took a monster to make her feel that way. At 9 p.m., during her break, Annie sat in the back alley with Rick's jacket folded on her lap. She stared at it, trying to make sense of everything. Who was Rick Burton? A monster who beat men half to death? A protector who stepped in when no one else would? Both? Neither? And why her? Out of all the people in this city, why had he decided she was worth protecting? The questions spiraled until her head ached. She pulled out her phone and Googled his name. The results were terrifying. Arrests that never stuck, rumors of executions, ties to drug trafficking, extortion, murder for hire. Rick Burton wasn't just dangerous, he was untouchable, operating above the law through fear and money, and carefully placed connections. One article included a photo from 5 years ago. Rick in a courtroom, his expression cold and bored as prosecutors failed to convict him. Even in a suit and tie, surrounded by cops, he looked like the most dangerous person in the room. Annie stared at that face, the same face that had looked at her last night with something almost like care. She closed the browser and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Tomorrow, she decided, she'd return his jacket. She'd thank him properly, look him in the eye, and move on with her life. She didn't need a dangerous man's protection. She didn't want to owe someone like Rick Burton anything. But deep down, beneath the fear and confusion and stubborn independence, a small voice whispered the truth she didn't want to admit. Without him, you'd be dead. Or worse. And Annie didn't know what scared her more, that it was true, or that she was starting to feel grateful. Annie spent 3 days working up the courage. 3 days of carrying Rick's jacket in her bag, folded carefully, smelling faintly of his cologne. 3 days of rehearsing what she'd say, how she'd stand, where she'd look. 3 days of talking herself into it, then out of it, then back in again. On the 4th day, she finally made herself move. She'd asked Tommy, the old dock worker, where to find Rick Burton. He'd given her an address with a warning look that said, "Are you sure about this?" She wasn't, but she went anyway. The Velvet Room sat on the corner of 5th and Archer, tucked between a pawn shop and a closed laundromat. From the outside, it looked like nothing, just a black door with no sign, no windows, no indication of what lay inside. Annie stood across the street for 10 minutes, clutching the jacket to her chest, before she finally crossed. 2 men stood outside the door. Both were tall, heavily built, with the kind of scars that told stories. One had tattoos crawling up his neck. The other had a jagged line across his jaw that looked like a knife had tried to split his face open. They noticed her immediately. "Lost, sweetheart?" the tattooed one asked, not unkindly. Annie's voice came out smaller than she wanted. I'm here to see Mr. Burton." Both men straightened. Their expressions shifted from casual to alert. "Mr. Burton doesn't take walk-ins," the scarred one said carefully. "You got business?" Annie held up the jacket. "I need to return this. And I need to thank him." The 2 men exchanged a look. Some silent communication passed between them. The tattooed one pulled out his phone, stepped aside, and spoke quietly into it. Annie couldn't hear the words, but she heard the tone respectful, cautious, as if reporting to someone you didn't want to disappoint. After a moment, he returned, his expression unreadable. He says let her in. The inside of the Velvet Room was nothing like Annie expected. Rich burgundy walls, leather booths, soft jazz playing from hidden speakers. The lighting was low, intimate, expensive. A handful of men sat scattered throughout, all of them pausing their conversations to watch her enter. Annie's heart hammered. She didn't belong here. This was a world of power and danger, and she was just a waitress with a borrowed jacket. "This way," the scarred guard said, gesturing toward the back. They walked past the main room, down a hallway lined with black and white photographs of the city decades ago, and stopped at a door made of dark wood. The guard knocked twice, then opened it. Rick Burton sat behind a mahogany desk, paperwork spread before him, a glass of amber liquid at his elbow. He looked up as Annie entered, his expression unreadable. "Wait outside," Rick said to the guard. The door closed with a soft click, and suddenly Annie was alone with the man who'd saved her life. "Annie," Rick said, leaning back in his chair. He didn't smile, but something in his eyes softened. "I didn't expect you." Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I came to return your jacket, and to say thank you." She stepped forward and placed the jacket carefully on his desk, her hands trembling slightly. Rick looked at the jacket, then back at her. "You didn't have to come all the way here for that." "Yes, I did." Annie forced herself to meet his eyes. "You saved me. I don't even know how to. What you did for me, The words tangled in her throat. Tears pricked her eyes, and she hated herself for it. "I'm sorry. I don't even know what to say." Rick stood slowly, moving around the desk. He was tall, even taller than she remembered, and his presence filled the room. But he didn't come too close, didn't crowd her space. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "Yes, I do." Annie's voice was firmer now. "That man would have, if you hadn't been there." She couldn't finish the sentence. "Didn't need to." Rick's jaw tightened. Men like him think they can take whatever they want because no one stops them. Someone needed to. "But why you?" The question tumbled out before Annie could stop it. "Why did you help me? You don't know me. I'm nobody." "You're not nobody." Rick's voice was sharp, almost angry. Then he softened. "You reminded me of someone. Someone I couldn't protect when it mattered." Annie stared at him, seeing something flicker across his face. Pain, old and buried deep. "Who?" she whispered. "My sister." Rick turned away, looking out the window at the city beyond. "She was 15. I was 17 and too stupid to see the danger. By the time I realized..." He didn't finish. Didn't need to. The silence stretched between them, heavy with shared grief. "I'm sorry," Annie said softly. Rick turned back to her. "Don't be. It was a long time ago, but when I saw that man grab you," his hands clenched into fists, "I couldn't let it happen again. Not when I could stop it." Annie's chest ached. This dangerous man, this mafia boss everyone feared, was just someone carrying guilt too heavy to put down. "Thank you," she said again, meaning it with every part of herself. "For seeing me. For stopping him. For everything." Rick studied her for a long moment. "You planning to keep working at the Iron Lantern?" "I don't have a choice. I need the money. You're safe there now. My men watch the bar. Anyone tries something, they'll handle it." Annie's stomach twisted. "I don't want to be someone's charity case. I don't want protection because..." "It's not charity." Rick's voice was firm. "And it's not negotiable. You work in a dangerous place. I'm making it less dangerous. That's all." Annie wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could take care of herself. But the memory of that man's hands on her, the sound of her shirt tearing, the helplessness, it was all too fresh. "Okay," she whispered. "Thank you." Rick nodded once. Then, unexpectedly, he picked up his jacket from the desk and held it out to her. "Keep it. It looks better on you anyway." Annie's eyes widened. "I can't." "You can." His tone left no room for argument. "And Annie, if you ever need anything at all, you call me. Understood?" He pulled a business card from his desk and handed it to her. "Just a phone number, no name." Annie took it with shaking hands, feeling like she'd just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. "Understood," she whispered. As she left the velvet room, jacket folded in her arms and card burning in her pocket, Annie realized something terrifying. Rick Burton wasn't just her protector. He was becoming something more, and she had no idea what that meant. 3 weeks passed, and Annie's life shifted in ways she couldn't have predicted. The Iron Lantern was different now, safer. The rowdy drunks who used to push boundaries suddenly knew where the lines were. The men who used to let their hands wander kept them to themselves. Even the air felt different, less threatening, more controlled. Annie noticed Rick's men everywhere. Not obviously they didn't wear signs or uniforms, but she'd learned to spot them. The guy nursing a beer in the corner for 3 hours without getting drunk. The 2 men by the door who never seemed to leave. The watchful eyes that followed her movements, not with lust, but with purpose. She was being guarded, protected, watched over like something valuable. It should have felt invasive. Instead, it felt like breathing easier for the first time in years. But the real change came on a Tuesday night, when everything started to unravel in the most unexpected way. Annie was clearing tables when she overheard 2 of Rick's men arguing near the bar. "I'm telling you, the schedule's wrong," one said, frustration evident. "We've got 3 guys on the South Dock and nobody covering the warehouse. Burton's gonna lose his mind when he finds out." "Then fix it," the other snapped. I don't do schedules. That's Danny's job, and Danny's in the hospital with a busted knee. Annie paused, tray balanced on her hip. She'd spent 2 years managing schedules at the Iron Lantern, coordinating shifts when people called out sick, juggling coverage when Dale needed someone last minute. Before she could talk herself out of it, she stepped closer. Excuse me. Both men turned, their expressions shifting from irritation to careful politeness. Everything okay, Annie? The taller one she thought his name was, Vic asked. I couldn't help overhearing. You need help with scheduling? Vic blinked. That's not really your concern. I know, but I've been doing schedules here for 2 years. If you need someone to organize coverage until your guy gets back, I could help. If you want, the 2 men exchanged uncertain glances. We'd have to ask the boss, Vic said carefully. Annie's heart jumped. Of course. I wanted to offer. That's all. 2 days later, Annie received a text from the number Rick had given her. Velvet Room, 6 p.m. If you're serious about helping. She showed up 10 minutes early, wearing her nicest jeans and a clean sweater, feeling absurdly nervous. Rick was waiting in the same office, but this time he wasn't alone. 3 men sat around the desk, Vic, another heavily tattooed enforcer, and an older man with gray hair and sharp eyes. Annie, Rick said, gesturing to an empty chair. Sit. She sat, hands folded in her lap, acutely aware of 4 dangerous men studying her. Vic says you offered to help with scheduling, Rick said. Yes. I mean, if you need it. I'm good with schedules. I've been doing them for years. The older man, Rick, introduced him as Frank. His operations manager leaned forward. This isn't waitress shifts, sweetheart. This is coordinating security across 12 locations, managing rotations, accounting for conflicts and backup coverage. I understand, Annie said, her voice steadier than she felt. But the principle's the same. You need bodies in places at specific times. You need backup when someone can't make it. You need to track who's worked too many hours and who's available. I can do that. Rick studied her for a long moment. Why? The question caught her off guard. What? Why do you want to help? His eyes were sharp, searching. You don't owe me anything, Annie. You already thanked me. You don't need to do this. Annie took a breath. Because you helped me when no one else would. Because for the first time in years, I don't go to work terrified. And because... She hesitated, then pushed forward. Because I'm tired of just surviving. I want to do something that matters, even if it's just making sure your guys show up where they're supposed to. Something shifted in Rick's expression, a crack in the ice. Brief but real. All right, he said finally. Frank will give you the current schedules. Fix them. If it works, we'll talk about making it regular. Annie threw herself into the work. She spread papers across her tiny kitchen table, lists of names, locations, time slots that made no sense. It took her 3 days to untangle the mess, cross-reference availability, and build a system that actually worked. She color-coded locations, created backup lists, built in buffer time for emergencies. When she finished, the chaos had become order clear, efficient, impossible to misread. She delivered the new schedules to Frank, who studied them with increasing surprise. This is actually good, he admitted, grudgingly. Better than what Danny was doing. Word spread quickly through Rick's organization. The waitress had skills. More than that, she treated everyone with respect, even the enforcers with blood under their nails, even the men whose reputations preceded them like thunderstorms. She learned names, asked about families, remembered details. When she discovered that one of the guards had a daughter's birthday coming up, she helped him find a gift online during her lunch break. Small acts of humanity in a world built on violence. And slowly, impossibly, Rick's hardened men started to soften around her. Rick watched it all from a distance, amazed. Annie moved through his world like light through darkness, not changing what his organization was, but making it somehow more bearable. His men smiled more, complained less, showed up on time because they didn't want to disappoint her. She wasn't trying to fix them or save them. She was just being kind. And kindness, Rick realized, was a weapon more powerful than fear in ways he'd never understood. One evening, Rick found Annie in Frank's office, explaining a coverage gap to 3 enforcers who hung on her every word like students before a beloved teacher. When she finished, they thanked her, and left with actual smiles. You're good at this, Rick said from the doorway. Annie jumped, startled. I didn't hear you. That's the point. He stepped inside. My men respect you. They respect you. I just help organize things. It's more than that. Rick's voice was quiet. You make them feel human. That's not easy in this world. Annie met his eyes. Everyone deserves to feel human, Rick. Even people who do terrible things. For a moment, neither spoke. The weight of that statement hung between them, an acknowledgement of what Rick was, what he'd done, and the possibility that he might be more than the sum of his crimes. Thank you, Rick said finally. For what? For seeing past the monster. Annie's chest tightened. You're not a monster. Monsters don't protect people. They don't give second chances. Rick looked away, uncomfortable with the grace she offered so freely. But deep down, in the place where Kara's ghost still lived, something warm flickered to life. Something that felt dangerously like hope. That night, as Annie walked home with Rick's jacket wrapped around her shoulders and his business card in her pocket, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't just helping Rick Burton's organization. She was becoming part of it. And the scariest part was she didn't want to leave. The first sign came on a Wednesday afternoon. Annie was restocking glasses behind the Iron Lantern's bar when Dale approached, his face tight with concern. Annie, got a minute? She set down the tray. What's wrong? Dale glanced around, then lowered his voice. That guy from a few weeks back, the one who attacked you, he's out. Annie's blood turned to ice. Out? What do you mean out? Released from the hospital 2 days ago. Word is he's been hanging around the neighborhood, asking questions. Dale's expression darkened. Asking about you. The glass in Annie's hand slipped, shattering against the floor. She stared at the broken pieces. Her mind suddenly back in that moment, his hands on her, her shirt tearing, the laughter that followed. Annie? Dale's voice seemed far away. You okay? She wasn't, but she nodded anyway, bending to clean up the glass with shaking hands. That night, Vic appeared at the bar during Annie's shift. He didn't sit, didn't order, just stood near the door like a sentinel, his eyes scanning every face that entered. Annie approached him during her break. You heard. Boss heard. Sent me to make sure you're covered. Vic's jaw was tight. The guy's got a broken jaw, 2 broken hands, and 3 cracked ribs. He should be in physical therapy, not lurking around bars. What does he want? Vic's silence was answer enough. Revenge. Annie felt the floor tilt beneath her. She'd been so focused on moving forward, on building this strange new life with Rick's organization, that she'd forgotten the past didn't just disappear. It waited. It festered. It came back with a vengeance. Does Rick know? She asked quietly. Rick knows everything. Vic's expression softened slightly. And he's handling it. You don't need to worry. But Annie did worry, because she'd seen what handling it looked like in Rick's world. And she didn't want more violence on her conscience, even violence meant to protect her. The nightmares started that night. Annie dreamed of torn fabric and rough hands, of laughter echoing in the darkness, of being grabbed and pulled and exposed while the world watched and did nothing. She woke at 3 a.m., gasping. Rick's jacket clutched to her chest like a shield. The nightmares continued for 3 nights, each one worse than the last, each one leaving her more exhausted, more fragile, more afraid. By Friday, Annie could barely keep her hands steady during her shift. She spilled drinks, mixed up orders, flinched every time the door opened, expecting to see the bully's face. Rick's men noticed. They tightened their presence around her, more guards, closer proximity, watchful eyes that never left her for long, but they couldn't protect her from her own mind. On Saturday night, Rick himself appeared at the Iron Lantern. He'd never come during one of Annie's shifts before, always kept his distance, maintained the separation between his world and hers. But tonight, he walked through the door at 9 p.m. and sat at the bar, his presence commanding immediate attention. Annie brought him his usual bourbon with trembling hands. You look tired, Rick said quietly. I'm fine. You're not. His eyes were sharp, missing nothing. You haven't been sleeping. Annie set down the glass harder than intended. How would you know? Because I know what nightmares look like. I've lived with them for 14 years. The honesty in his voice stopped her defensive response cold. She looked at him, really looked, and saw the exhaustion hidden beneath the control, the weight he carried that matched her own. I keep seeing his face, she whispered. I keep feeling his hands. And now he's out there, somewhere. And her voice broke. Rick's expression hardened. He won't touch you again. You can't promise that. Yes, I can. Rick leaned forward, his voice low and lethal. Annie, I have 30 men watching for him. Every bar, every street corner, every place he might show up. The moment he surfaces, we'll know. And then what? You'll hurt him again? Kill him? Annie's eyes filled with tears. I don't want that. I don't want more violence because of me. This isn't about you wanting it. It's about keeping you safe. At what cost? Annie's voice rose slightly, drawing glances from nearby patrons. She lowered it to a harsh whisper. At what cost to your soul? To mine? I can't live knowing people get hurt because I exist. Rick stared at her, something shifting behind his eyes. He'd expected fear, gratitude, maybe relief. Not moral conflict. Not this kind of strength. What do you want me to do? He asked finally. Let him come after you? Wait until he finishes what he started. I want. Annie took a shaky breath. I want to not be afraid anymore. I want to sleep without seeing his face. I want to stop jumping every time a door opens. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I want my life back, Rick. And I don't know how to get it. For a long moment, Rick said nothing. Then he did something unexpected. He reached across the bar and took her hand gently, carefully, like she was made of glass. You'll get it back, he said quietly. I promise you that. But right now, you need to let me keep you safe. Can you do that? Annie looked down at their joined hands, his scarred and calloused from violence, hers small and trembling from fear. Two people from different worlds, connected by a single moment of brutality. Okay, she whispered. Rick squeezed her hand once, then released it and stood. I'm walking you home tonight. No arguments. Annie didn't argue. She was too tired to fight, too scared to pretend she didn't need the protection. As they left the Iron Lantern together, Annie wrapped in Rick's jacket. Rick's presence, a wall between her and the darkness, neither noticed the figure watching from across the street. The bully stood in the shadows, his face still swollen from Rick's beating, his hands wrapped in bandages, but his eyes were clear, focused, burning with rage. He'd been watching for days, waiting for the right moment. And now, seeing Annie under Rick Burton's personal protection, seeing the Mafia boss walk her home like she was something precious, that rage crystallized into purpose. If he couldn't have his revenge directly, he'd find another way. He'd make them both pay. The bully melted back into the darkness, already planning his return. The Iron Lantern was unusually quiet for a Saturday night. Annie felt it the moment she walked through the door for her evening shift, a tension in the air like the pressure before a thunderstorm. Conversations were muted. Laughter felt forced. Even the regulars who normally shouted over the jukebox spoke in hushed tones. Everyone was waiting for something to happen. Dale pulled her aside before she could clock in. Rick's dealing with a situation across town. Territory dispute with the Kozlov crew. His guys are spread thin tonight. Annie's stomach dropped. How thin? Vic's outside with one other. That's it. Dale's expression was grim. Look, if you want to call out sick, I'll cover for you. No one would blame you. Annie looked at the nearly empty bar, at the few customers scattered across tables, at the job that had kept her alive for 2 years. She thought about her mother's medication sitting on the kitchen counter, about the rent check she'd written that morning, about the electric bill with the red final notice stamp. She couldn't afford to be afraid. I'll work, she said, tying her apron with hands that only shook a little. The first 3 hours passed without incident. Annie served drinks, cleared tables, made small talk with regulars who seemed determined to act like everything was normal. Vic checked in twice, his presence at the door a constant reminder that danger lurked somewhere beyond these walls. At 9:47 p.m., the door opened. Annie looked up reflexively, a habit she'd developed over the past weeks, always checking, always watching, and her blood turned to ice. The bully stood in the doorway. He looked different than she remembered. Thinner. His face was still swollen and discolored from Rick's beating, marked with healing bruises in shades of purple and yellow. Both hands were wrapped in white bandages. His eyes, though his eyes were clear, focused, burning with something dark and terrible. He smiled when he saw her, a slow, cruel smile that made Annie's skin crawl. The bar went dead silent. Every head turned. Every conversation stopped. The same suffocating quiet that had descended the night he'd attacked her returned like a ghost, wrapping around the room and squeezing. Vic moved immediately, stepping through the door behind the bully. You need to leave. Now. The bully didn't even look at him. His eyes were locked on Annie, drinking in her fear like fine wine. I just want a drink, he said, his voice slurred slightly from the damaged jaw. That's all. Just one drink. That's legal, ain't it? You're banned, Vic said, his hand moving to his waistband where Annie knew he kept a gun. Walk out now, or you'll be carried out. Carried out by who? You? The bully laughed, a wet, painful sound. Burton ain't here to save his little pet, and you're just one man with one gun. You gonna shoot me in front of 40 witnesses? Vic's jaw tightened. They both knew he was right. Shooting an unarmed man in a crowded bar would bring police, investigations, problems Rick couldn't afford. The bully took a step inside. Then another. Vic blocked his path, but didn't draw his weapon. The standoff hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. Annie's heart hammered so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Her hands gripped the edge of the bar, knuckles white. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to find somewhere safe. But she'd spent 2 years running from fear. 2 years making herself small, apologizing for existing, surviving on scraps of dignity. And suddenly, standing there in the suffocating silence, something inside her snapped. Not broke, snapped. Like a wire pulled too tight, finally releasing. Annie stepped out from behind the bar. "Annie, don't," Vic started. But she was already moving, walking toward the bully with legs that shook but carried her forward anyway. The bully's smile widened. "There she is. Come to apologize? Come to beg me not to?" "Stop." Annie's voice cut through his words, stronger than she'd ever heard it. She stopped 5 feet away from him, close enough to see the hatred in his eyes, far enough to run if she needed to. But she wouldn't run. Not this time. "You remember me?" The bully sneered, his bandaged hands gesturing toward his ruined face. "Bet your boss ain't here to save you this time. Bet you're real scared now, ain't you?" Annie's whole body trembled. Fear screamed through her veins, begging her to collapse, to cry, to be the victim he expected. Instead, she straightened her spine and looked him dead in the eye. "No," she said quietly. "I'm not scared of you anymore." The bully blinked, confused. "What?" "I said I'm not scared." Annie's voice grew steadier with each word. "You're nothing but a coward who picks on people weaker than you. You hurt me because you thought no one would stop you. But someone did. And now you're here because you're pathetic and angry and you want revenge. Shut up." "No." Annie took 1 step closer, and the bully actually flinched. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to walk in here and make me afraid. You don't control me. You don't own my fear." Her voice cracked but didn't break. "You ripped my shirt and humiliated me, and I survived it. You got exactly what you deserved, and now you're standing here with broken hands and a shattered jaw, and you still think you have power over me." Tears streamed down her face, but her voice never wavered. "You don't. You never did, and you never will." The bar was so quiet Annie could hear her own heartbeat. The bully stared at her, his expression cycling through rage, confusion, and something that looked almost like shame. "Walk away," Annie said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're done here. You've lost. Go home and heal and never come back." For one terrible moment, Annie thought he'd lunge at her anyway, thought violence would erupt and prove her wrong about everything. Then the door burst open behind the bully. Rick Burton stepped through, flanked by 6 men, all of them armed, all of them ready for war. His suit was disheveled, his face dark with fury, his eyes locked on the bully with murderous intent. But he stopped when he saw Annie standing there, tears on her face but fire in her eyes, facing down her nightmare alone. Rick's expression shifted from rage to something else, something like pride. "Annie," Rick said quietly, "step back." But Annie didn't move. She kept her eyes on the bully, waiting. The bully looked at Rick, then at Annie, then at the 6 armed men behind Rick. And finally, he understood. He'd lost. Without another word, the bully turned and walked out of the Iron Lantern bar, his shoulders hunched, his bandaged hands hanging uselessly at his sides. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Annie collapsed. Rick caught Annie before she hit the ground, his arms wrapped around her, strong and steady, holding her up as her legs finally gave out. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation drained away all at once, leaving her shaking and gasping for air. "I've got you," Rick murmured, his voice rough. "I've got you." Annie buried her face in his chest, her entire body trembling. She wasn't crying, not yet, but she couldn't stop shaking, couldn't catch her breath, couldn't believe what she'd just done. Rick lifted her effortlessly, carrying her toward the back office while his men secured the bar. Vic followed, closing the door behind them and giving them privacy. Rick set Annie down gently on the worn leather couch, then knelt in front of her, his hands on her shoulders, grounding her. "Look at me," he said firmly. "Annie, look at me." She raised her eyes to his, still trembling. "Breathe," Rick instructed. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. With me," he demonstrated, and Annie followed, matching her breathing to his until the panic subsided enough for her to think clearly. "What the hell were you thinking?" Rick's voice was tight with controlled emotion. He could have killed you. He could have grabbed you, hurt you, but he didn't. Annie's voice was hoarse but steady. I stood up to him, Rick, and he backed down. Because I walked through that door. No. Annie shook her head firmly. He was already beaten before you arrived. He just needed you there to make it official. She took a shaky breath. I'm tired of being afraid. Tired of being the victim. Tired of needing someone to save me. Rick stared at her, something shifting in his expression. He'd expected her to crumble, to need comforting, to confirm his belief that she needed protecting. Instead, she'd proven she could protect herself. You were incredible, he said finally, his voice quiet with wonder. Terrifying and incredible. Annie laughed, a broken, exhausted sound. I was terrified. But you did it anyway. That's courage, Annie. Real courage. Rick's hands tightened on her shoulders. Most people freeze. Run. You walked toward him. I didn't have a choice. If I let him control me one more time, I'd never be free. Tears finally spilled down her cheeks. I had to take my power back, even if it killed me. Rick's jaw clenched. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close. And Annie let herself collapse into him, not out of weakness, but out of exhaustion. She'd fought her battle. Now she could rest. He won't come back, Rick said against her hair. My men are following him right now. If he even thinks about returning. Don't hurt him, Annie interrupted, pulling back to look at Rick. Please. He's already broken. Let him heal and disappear. No more violence. Rick's expression darkened. He attacked you twice, and I defeated him twice. Once with your fists, once with my words. Annie's eyes were fierce despite the tears. If you hurt him now, you take away what I just won. You make me a victim again instead of a survivor. Rick studied her for a long moment, conflict warring across his face. Everything in him wanted to destroy the man who terrorized her. But everything in him also wanted to give Annie what she needed. And what she needed was agency, choice, the power to decide her own fate. All right, Rick said finally. We'll make sure he leaves town. But we won't touch him, unless he comes back. He won't, Annie said with certainty. He's done. Rick hoped she was right, but he'd have his men watch anyway, just in case. Outside, Vic had cleared the bar of customers and was coordinating with Rick's security team. The Iron Lantern felt like a crime scene without the crime, empty, tense, waiting for resolution. Dale approached Rick and Annie as they emerged from the office. Is she okay? Dale asked, genuine concern in his voice. I'm fine, Annie answered before Rick could. Dale, I'm sorry for the disruption. Don't apologize. Dale's voice was firm. What you did out there. Annie, I've worked in bars for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like that. You faced down a monster and won. Annie managed a weak smile. I had good backup. Dale glanced at Rick. Yeah, you did. He cleared his throat. Take tomorrow off. Paid. You've earned it. Rick's hand settled on the small of Annie's back, protective, possessive, comforting. I'm taking her home. Vic will stay posted outside her building tonight. Rick, you don't have to. Yes, I do. His tone left no room for argument. Humor me, just for tonight. Annie was too exhausted to fight. She nodded, and Rick guided her toward the door. The drive to Annie's apartment was silent. Rick's black sedan moved through the city streets like a shadow, Vic following in a second car behind them. Annie stared out the window, watching the city blur past, her mind replaying the confrontation over and over. Had she really done that? Stood up to the man who'd terrorized her? Looked him in the eye and taken her power back? It felt surreal. Like a dream she'd wake from and find herself still small, still afraid, still broken. You're thinking too much, Rick said quietly. Annie turned to him. How do you know? Because I recognize the look. You're second-guessing yourself, wondering if you did the right thing. Did I? Rick pulled up in front of her building and killed the engine. He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. Annie, what you did tonight, most people couldn't do that in a lifetime. You faced your fear head-on and won, not with violence, not with threats, with pure strength of will. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture surprisingly tender. You were never weak. You just needed someone to remind you how strong you are. Annie's chest tightened. You saved me once, Rick. But tonight you saved yourself. Rick's voice was thick with emotion he rarely showed. And in doing that, you saved me too. What do you mean? Rick looked away, jaw working. I've spent 14 years trying to protect people because I failed my sister. I thought if I could save enough people, hurt enough bad guys, Control enough of the city. Maybe I'd stop feeling guilty. He met her eyes again. But watching you tonight, seeing you take back your power, instead of relying on mine, I realized something. Protection isn't about control. It's about giving people the strength to save themselves. Tears welled in Annie's eyes. Rick, you changed me, Annie. You walked into my world with your kindness and your schedules and your ridiculous belief that even monsters deserve to be treated like humans. And you made me want to be better. His voice dropped to a whisper. You made me believe I could be. Annie couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The Mafia boss sitting before her, the man who'd built an empire on fear and violence, looked more vulnerable in this moment than she'd ever seen him. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing gently. You're already better than you think, Rick. You just needed someone to remind you. They sat in silence, hands intertwined, two broken people who'd somehow found wholeness in each other. Finally, Rick cleared his throat and pulled away. Come on, let's get you inside. Vic will be outside all night. As they walked to her door, Annie felt something shift inside her chest, something warm and terrifying and wonderful. She was falling for Rick Burton, and she had no idea what to do about it. Upstairs in her apartment, Annie stood at the window and watched Rick's car disappear into the night. Vic's sedan remained, parked across the street, a silent guardian. She touched her fingers to her lips, remembering the feeling of Rick's hand in hers, the vulnerability in his eyes, the way he'd looked at her like she was something precious. Tomorrow would bring new questions, new complications, new challenges. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, Annie felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. She'd faced her monster and won. She'd proven to herself that she was strong, and she'd discovered that even the darkest men could find light if someone was brave enough to show them the way. Annie pulled Rick's jacket tighter around her shoulders, breathing in the familiar scent, and finally allowed herself to believe everything was going to be okay. Morning came soft and golden through Annie's window. She woke to find herself still wearing Rick's jacket, still dressed in yesterday's clothes, having collapsed onto her bed sometime after midnight without the energy to change. Her body ached with exhaustion, but her mind felt clearer than it had in weeks. She'd done it. She'd faced her attacker and won. The realization settled over her like a warm blanket, chasing away the last remnants of nightmares that had plagued her sleep. Annie showered, dressed in clean jeans and a soft sweater, and made herself coffee. Through the window, she could see Vic's car still parked across the street. She wondered if he'd been there all night, if he'd slept at all, if this was what Rick's protection really looked like: constant, vigilant, never-ending. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. How are you feeling? Annie knew immediately who it was. Rick had probably gotten a new phone, or this was one of several he kept for different purposes. She typed back. Better. Tired but better. Thank you for last night. The response came within seconds. You did all the hard work. I just showed up at the end. Annie smiled despite herself. You showed up when it mattered. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, can I see you today? Not business. Just, I want to make sure you're okay. Annie's heart did something complicated in her chest. This wasn't the Mafia boss demanding her presence. This was Rick, just Rick, asking permission to check on someone he cared about. Yes. Where? I'll pick you up at noon. Dress casual. Rick arrived exactly at noon in a different car, a sleek gray sedan instead of his usual black. He was dressed casually too. Dark jeans, a fitted black Henley that showed the edges of his chest, tattoos, leather jacket. Without the suit, he looked younger, less intimidating, almost normal, almost. You look better, he said as Annie climbed into the passenger seat. I feel better. She studied him. You look tired. Didn't sleep much. Rick pulled away from the curb, navigating through weekend traffic with practiced ease, kept replaying last night, making sure my guys were positioned right, checking reports on our friend. And he left town this morning, bought a bus ticket to Philadelphia. Vic followed him to the station, watched him board. Rick's jaw tightened. He's gone, Annie. For good. Relief washed through her so powerfully she had to blink back tears. Thank you. Don't thank me. You're the one who broke him. Rick glanced at her. I've ended men with bullets and beatings, Annie, but I've never seen someone destroyed the way you destroyed him, with words, with truth, with pure moral force. That was extraordinary. Annie didn't know what to say to that, so she changed the subject. Where are we going? Somewhere I haven't been in years. Somewhere I want to show you. 20 minutes later, they pulled up to a small park on the edge of the city. It wasn't much, just a few acres of grass, Some old trees, a rusted playground that had seen better days, but it was quiet, peaceful, away from the noise and danger of Rick's usual world. They walked in silence along a gravel path, the autumn sun warm on their faces. "I used to bring my sister here," Rick said finally. "When she was little, our parents fought constantly, and Kara would cry. So I'd bring her here, push her on the swings, tell her stories until she forgot to be sad." Annie's chest tightened. This was sacred ground, a place Rick associated with the person he'd loved and lost. "She loved the swings," Rick continued, his voice distant with memory. "Used to beg me to push her higher, higher, like she wanted to fly away from everything." He stopped walking, staring at the empty swing set. "The day she died, I was at a party when I should have been protecting her. I chose my own fun over her safety, and she paid the price." "Rick," Annie touched his arm gently. "You were 17. You couldn't have known. But I should have." His voice was rough. "I knew our father had enemies, knew our family was in danger. I just didn't care enough to stay close." He turned to Annie, his eyes haunted. "For 14 years, I've tried to make up for that failure, built an empire, protected hundreds of people, destroyed anyone who threatened what was mine. But none of it brought her back." Annie took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "You can't save the past, Rick, but you can honor it. Everything you've done, the protection, the control, even the violence, it all came from love. From guilt? Yes, but also from love. That matters." Rick stared at their joined hands. "When I saw you standing up to that man last night, I realized something. I've been trying to protect people by controlling their safety. But you don't want to be controlled. You want to be empowered. There's a difference." "There is," Annie agreed softly. "I can't control your safety, Annie. I can't prevent every bad thing from happening to you. But I can give you the tools, the backup, the strength to face those things yourself." Rick squeezed her hand. "That's what real protection looks like. Not cages, not control, just being there when you need me." Annie's eyes filled with tears. "You've been there every time I needed you, even before I knew I needed you." They stood in silence, hands intertwined, two damaged souls finding healing in each other's honesty. "I need to tell you something," Rick said finally. "And I need you to really hear it." Annie nodded, her heart racing. "What started as guilt protecting you because you reminded me of Kara, that's not why I'm here anymore." Rick turned to face her fully, his expression raw. "I'm here because you make me want to be better. Because when I'm with you, I don't feel like a monster. I feel like maybe I'm worthy of redemption." Annie's breath caught. "I don't know what this is between us," Rick continued. "I don't know if someone like me deserves someone like you. But I know that when I thought that man might hurt you again, I would have burned the entire city down to stop him. And when I saw you face him alone, I've never been more terrified or more proud in my entire life." "Rick," Annie whispered, "I'm not good at this. At feelings. At being vulnerable. My world doesn't allow for weakness." His voice dropped. "But with you, I want to try. I want to be the man you see when you look at me, not the monster everyone else sees." Annie reached up and touched his face, her palm against his rough jaw. "I see both, Rick. The monster and the man. And I'm not afraid of either one." Rick closed his eyes, leaning into her touch like a man starving for gentleness. "You changed my life," Annie said softly. "You gave me safety when I had none. You showed me I was worth protecting. You helped me find strength I didn't know I had." She stepped closer. "But more than that, you let me see you. The real you. The one buried under all that armor and violence. And that person, that's who I'm falling for." Rick's eyes snapped open. "Falling for?" Annie smiled through her tears. "Yes, falling for. Terrifying, isn't it?" "Absolutely terrifying," Rick admitted. Then, slowly, carefully, like he was afraid she might disappear, he cupped her face in his hands. "I don't deserve you." "Maybe not, but you have me anyway." Rick kissed her, then gentle at first, tentative, like he'd forgotten how to be soft. But Annie kissed him back, pouring everything she felt into that moment. Gratitude, trust, hope, and something that felt dangerously close to love. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Rick rested his forehead against hers. "What now?" he whispered. "Now we figure it out, together." Annie smiled. "No more saving me, Rick. We save each other." Rick pulled her close, holding her like she was the most precious thing in his world. And in that moment, in a forgotten park, where a little girl once flew on swings, two broken people found something neither expected. Healing, partnership, love. The darkness didn't disappear. Rick's world was still dangerous. Annie's struggles didn't vanish. But together they were stronger than either had been alone, and that was enough. 3 months later, the iron lantern looked different in the late afternoon light, cleaner somehow, brighter, like the shadows that had clung to its corners for decades had finally loosened their grip. Annie stood behind the bar, going over schedules with Dale, her tablet propped against a stack of glasses. She'd officially taken over scheduling for both the bar and 3 of Rick's other establishments, turning chaos into order one spreadsheet at a time. "You're too good at this," Dale grumbled good-naturedly. "I'm starting to think you're wasted as a waitress." Annie laughed. "I'm not just a waitress anymore, remember?" It was true. Over the past 3 months, Annie had gradually transitioned into a new role, part operations coordinator, part human resources liaison, part unofficial heart of Rick Burton's organization. She still worked shifts at the Iron Lantern because she wanted to, not because she had to. Rick paid her well for the coordination work, enough that her mother's medical bills were finally under control. More than that, she'd found purpose. She'd transformed Rick's cold, violent empire into something that still operated in darkness, but treated its people with dignity. His men respected her. Some even loved her. She'd become the person they came to with problems, knowing she'd listen without judgment and find solutions that didn't involve bloodshed. She'd made Rick Burton's world a little more human. And in doing so, she'd discovered who she was meant to be. The door opened, and Annie looked up to see Rick enter, dressed in his usual tailored suit, flanked by Vic and Frank. But when his eyes found hers, the dangerous Mafia boss softened into just Rick, the man who'd held her through nightmares, who'd taught her to fight back against fear, who'd somehow become her partner in every sense of the word. "Ready?" Rick asked. Annie saved her work and grabbed her jacket, a new one she'd bought herself, though she still kept Rick's original hanging in her closet like a talisman. Ready. They were opening a new establishment tonight, not a bar or a gambling den, but something different. Something Annie had suggested and Rick had funded. A community center in one of the city's roughest neighborhoods. A place where kids could go after school, where families could find resources, where people like Annie's younger self might find help before they drowned in debt and desperation. It was Rick's way of honoring Kara's memory, and Annie's way of making sure other young women didn't have to fight as hard as she had. The community center was buzzing with activity when they arrived. Volunteers were setting up tables. Local families were already exploring the space. Someone had hung a banner that read, "Burton Community Center, a place for everyone." Rick stood at the entrance, watching it all with an expression Annie had learned to recognize, pride mixed with disbelief, like he couldn't quite accept that he'd built something good. "Your sister would be proud," Annie said softly, slipping her hand into his. Rick squeezed her fingers. "I hope so." Vic approached, tablet in hand. "Boss, we've got 73 families signed up for the after-school program already, and the city councilman wants to meet with you about expanding to other neighborhoods." Rick nodded. "Set it up." As Vic walked away, Frank appeared. "The security team is positioned. No one gets in who shouldn't be here." "Good." Rick turned to Annie. "You ready to give your speech?" Annie's stomach fluttered. "I hate public speaking." "You faced down a man who tried to destroy you. You can handle a speech." Rick's smile was warm. "Besides, this was your idea. These people need to hear from you." 20 minutes later, Annie stood on a small stage in the center's main room, microphone in hand, looking out at faces, so many faces of people who needed hope as desperately as she once had. She took a breath and began. 3 months ago, I was drowning, working 2 jobs, barely keeping my head above water, watching my mother suffer because I couldn't afford her medication. I felt invisible, powerless, like the world didn't care if I lived or died. The room was silent, every eye on her. Then something terrible happened. I was attacked at work, and someone stepped in to help me, someone who didn't have to, someone who most people feared, but who saw me when I was invisible, who protected me when I was powerless. Annie's eyes found Rick standing at the back of the room. He nodded encouragingly. That moment changed my life, not just because I was saved, but because I learned something important. We all have the power to save each other, to see the people who are drowning and throw them a lifeline, to turn our pain into purpose, our fear into strength. She gestured to the space around them. This center exists because someone believed that even the darkest places can create light, that even people with complicated pasts can build better futures. This is a place for everyone who's ever felt invisible, powerless, or alone. A place where you can find help, find community, find hope. Annie's voice grew stronger. We can't erase the hard things in life, but we can face them together. We can lift each other up. We can choose to be the person who steps in when someone needs help. Applause erupted, genuine, warm, grateful. As Annie stepped off the stage, Rick was there waiting, pride shining in his eyes. "You're incredible," he murmured, pulling her close. "We're incredible," Annie corrected. Together. Later that night, after the crowd had dispersed and the volunteers had gone home, Rick and Annie stood alone in the empty center, the lights dimmed, the space peaceful. "Remember the night you asked, 'Who's gonna stop me now?'" Annie said softly. Rick's arm tightened around her waist. "The night that changed everything. I was terrified, broken, convinced I'd never be safe again." Annie turned to face him. "And now look at us, building community centers, helping families, making real change. You made that change, Annie. You walked into my world of violence and showed me there was another way." Rick cupped her face. "You saved me in ways you'll never fully understand." Annie smiled. "We saved each other. That's what partnership means." They kissed, soft and sweet, in a space built from redemption and hope. When they finally pulled apart, Rick voiced the question that had been building for weeks. "Move in with me." Annie's eyes widened. "What?" "Move in with me. Not because you're under my protection. Not because I'm trying to control you, but because I love you, and I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep with you every night." His voice was raw with vulnerability. "I want to build a life with you, Annie. A real one." Tears filled Annie's eyes. "You love me?" Desperately, completely, terrifyingly. Rick brushed away a tear with his thumb. "I know my world is dangerous. I know I'm not the safest choice. But I swear to you, I will spend every day trying to be worthy of you." "You already are," Annie whispered. Then louder, "Yes, yes, I'll move in with you." Rick's smile was blinding, the first truly unguarded joy Annie had ever seen on his face. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her around, both of them laughing like teenagers, instead of two people who'd survived more darkness than most could imagine. As they drove home that night, to the penthouse Rick owned, but that would now be theirs, Annie looked out at the city lights and marveled at how completely her life had transformed. 3 months ago, she'd been a victim, powerless, afraid. Now she was a survivor, a builder, a partner to one of the city's most powerful men. She'd faced her monster and won. She'd found strength she didn't know she possessed. She'd discovered that love could grow even in the darkest soil, that redemption was possible for anyone brave enough to reach for it. "What are you thinking?" Rick asked, glancing at her. Annie smiled. "I'm thinking about that question you asked 3 months ago. Who's gonna stop me now?" And, "Nobody." Annie laced her fingers through his. "Who's gonna stop us now?" Rick laughed deep, genuine, free. "Nobody, baby, nobody." And as they drove through the city, they were slowly transforming from the inside out, one community center, one act of kindness, one moment of courage at a time. Annie knew it was true. They'd both been broken, both been lost. But together, they'd found something neither expected. Healing, purpose, love, home. The darkness hadn't disappeared. It never would completely. But they'd learned to carry light into it, to be the people who stepped in when others needed saving, who chose kindness over cruelty, hope over despair. They'd become each other's second chance. And that was the most powerful thing of all. Thanks for sticking with this story till the end. If you enjoyed it, you're going to love the next one. It's packed with unexpected turns and heartfelt moments. Click the image on your screen to keep the journey going, and make sure to hit subscribe for more amazing stories. Drop a comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I can't wait to see what you think.